Hey, look at that.
Hey, we're live calling Chris Anderson in London.
This is Chris Anderson in London, calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
In Chicago, look, we're in the normal place.
I know, right?
Neither of us has gone anywhere.
I'm off. I'm out.
We're not in Mexico, Normandy, wherever we are. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help and support of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. We're glad you're here. Chris and I are glad we're here. We may travel the globe, but we always manage to get back, or almost always, on Sunday afternoons to talk about history and have a cocktail. And today we're going to be talking about World War II, a British artillery unit, oral history, and who knows what, with a wonderful British historian named Peter Hart. We're just buttering up right now so he doesn't leave while he's standing by. Chris, who is joining us today?
Well, so far we've got Marcus, so that's good. We can get started.
Nice.
Stephen Dean and Doreen is back with us after her tour de force in the theater, so we're glad to have her back. And Lizzie Borden, Neil.
I see Lizzie. Yeah, I was actually just reading about Lizzie Borden this weekend. And,
she's a relation.
In Fall River and the various interesting activities, social and murderous activities that she was involved in. Well, we're glad everybody's here. There's Kathy Hurst back in the U.S. and Neil saying, I support Ukraine, and we appreciate the sentiment. And Chris, I think we can probably get this show underway. What do you think? Do you think we got enough people standing by? We have enough equity here to pull that off?
So. Yeah, I think it's a wise idea. Ready? The bar is open.
The bar is open. What's on tap today?
Well, we have a really special guest tonight, and I got to admit up front that I'm a bit of a fanboy, so truth in lending. Yep. So we're joined this week by Peter Hart. Peter Hart is an author and historian. He was the oral historian for the Imperial War Museum. He's written countless wonderful books on First and Second World War history, and he's going to talk with us tonight about his book At Close Range, which has just come out in paperback, which is Life and Death in an Artillery Regiment, 1939 to 1945, which is wonderful. And I also want to mention that he is the co-host of Pete and Gary's Military History, which is a wonderful podcast I listen to. And I have to say, it's one of those things that helped me get through our many lockdowns here. So without Pete and Gary, it would have been a much darker place. So thanks.
I thought it was me. I thought I was helping you get through the lockdown.
God, no.
Wow, this disappointment is rampant.
I know. Well, yeah. So welcome, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
Peter.
Thanks a lot.
Nice
to see you both.
Is it Pete or Peter?
I'm a Pete.
Honestly, calling a British historian Pete seems like going to Buckingham Palace and saying, "Yo, Liz." Seems a little off, but we'll try to make it work.
I don't mind.
So I want to dive right in because there's an awful lot to talk about, and I think a lot of what we're going to do is explain some things about the unit that most Americans don't understand because it's the British Army. So right out of the gate, who were the South Nottingham Hussars? And what the heck is a yeomanry cavalry unit that's actually an artillery unit? What's going on with all that?
Well, the British Army tries to keep its titles from the past. So they were.
Sorry. Whoops. We put you in the left position.
Jesus! Stop! Get your fingers off the buttons.
So there had been cavalry. I mean, they were formed to beat up the working classes of Britain. They were sort of gentlemen, yeomen, formed in the round about the time of the French Revolution, and then they'd served in that capacity sort of on and off. Then they'd been mobilised for the Boer War as cavalry, and then they fought in the First World War as cavalry. Then switched over to being a machine gun unit, infantry, and then in the 1920s they didn't need cavalry, so the decision was taken to switch them to being artillery, and they became 107 Regiment, Royal Horse Artillery. which with 2 batteries, 425 battery and 426 batteries. That's good.
So Peter, this has been called a Band of Brothers story, because like the Stephen Ambrose book about Easy Company, it follows one unit from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. You have done a great deal of oral history work for World War I, World War II, I think 20 plus years at the Imperial War Museum. Why did you decide to write a book about this particular unit, which I got to say probably nobody in the United States has ever heard of? I don't know how well known they would or would not be in the UK.
They would not be known in the UK either. No, the idea was we were, when I worked at the War Museum, we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of oral history later, but one of the weaknesses is that you need a lot of people from the same unit. If you only have 1 or 2, you've got no real idea what's going on. You've just got their impressions. But there's one person's impression of an incident, right? Lots of holes in it. But if you interview 50, and I did for the South Nottingham Hussars, 107, then whoops.
Then you knock over your microphone. Are you sure you're a podcaster? I mean, are you sure you've done this before?
This drink's stronger than I thought. but if you do lots, then you can imagine if I have lots of hands, then you can't see. You've got you don't have holes in your account, or you still do. You can't interview senior officers; they died, but you can sometimes get up to majors, and I did interview some majors, and it's much better if you're all talking about the same thing. So when I worked for the War Museum, I did 39 years with the War Museum. I'm really old.
But that's still 20 plus.
Almost twice, yes. And when I worked there, we wanted to pick an artillery unit because we were very aware that artillery often gets missed out of the equation when you're talking about military history. And it's very much, to me, especially as a 1918, as a great war historian, as we call it, it's very important to get the all-arms battle. It is the all-arms battle that counts. No one arm is superior. Each has their vital role to play. But the artillery in the First and Second World War are crucial, really crucial. So we wanted to really get to grips with artillery in the Second World War, and so we looked around for a unit. Now, the way we found the South Nottingham Hussars was very easy. My aged parents lived in Chesterfield, which is 20 miles from Nottingham, and it's as simple as that. And also, they had a very strong regimental association. And that was key. They were so helpful. And the people I interviewed were the people running the association, because I did the interviews in the late 80s. So they were pretty well the age I and looking at it, Chris, I am now. So no offense, Chris.
No, take it.
So I'm in the same category, yeah.
Well, they're in their late. Well, you look young and virile. That's because you're American and probably had work done, But the thing about it was just wonderful because they were still young enough to talk well, and they were a bright unit. Artillery tend to be bright, not as bright as engineers, but they tend to be bright, and that meant they could give a good account of themselves. And the interviews varied in length from a bad interview, say 2 hours, 3 hours, done in 2 sessions, that would be, and the better ones are pushing up to 20 hours, which will be done in. They're normally done in 2-hour sessions, so it's 10 sessions. And it was amazing how close I got to the people. I'm not naturally I'm not sentimental in that way, but now I look back on that time as a sort of golden age of meeting people, and now they're heroes of my book. And of course, I knew them. They've all been dead 10 years now. I think the last one died. Was Ray Ellis, I think, and he died a bit ago now. We'll talk about Ray Ellis later. That's why I mentioned that name that none of you have heard of, just like you haven't heard of the South Nottingham Hussars. So that's why we came to do we just fitted, and we got the 50 interviews. The book comes from the interviews. I don't believe you can do a book from 2 or 3 diaries and 1 or 2 interviews, and I certainly don't believe you can do it now. I mean, Stephen Ambrose will have done his when the lads were about 60. from my remembrance of when it came out, the book came out. You can't do it now. You could do you can't even do a Korean War unit now. You could only, you'd be pushed to do the Falklands. It's Falklands for us is the last thing. For you, the Vietnam War is getting close to the limits of getting 50 people from one unit, still alive, still compos mentis, not too ill. That's how we did it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I see a lot of parallels with what you're saying with when I was interviewing members of the 101st Airborne and how that all worked out. But one thing I did want to touch on again, just to kind of familiarize people, the motto of the Royal Regiment of Artillery is Ubique, everywhere, and the South Knots were everywhere. So just so people know something about their service, kind of briefly, what's their campaign history for World War II? What's this book cover?
It's not quite everywhere, but it is some very vicious campaigns. So they start off in England in the Phoney War. Then in the Phoney War, still they move to Palestine, where they're with the cavalry division. They are literally in a cavalry division. In fact, the Royal Artillery Regiment for that, for the cavalry division. Then they're moved up with the declaration of war with Italy. They're moved up and they fight in the 1940 the December 1940 campaign, Operation Compass and things like that. They do very well as a detached battery that does really well there. Then they go off to Tobruk, and they are one of the key batteries in the defense of Tobruk. Tobruk could not have been defended against tanks without artillery. There's a 1st RHA there. There's 104 Regiment RHA as well. And these guns are absolutely crucial to maintain. When the tanks come rolling in, the infantry can't stop them. It has to be artillery. And artillery is the great tank killer. It's always there. It's a Ubique. It's just there. They fight that campaign. They do remarkably well, and then another battery's added, 520 battery. So it's then a 3-battery regiment, and they're given they've got 25 pounders up to this point, and then they go off to up towards what becomes the Battle of Knightsbridge, where they are completely destroyed. They're surrounded by tanks. Again, we might come back to this, and then they go on from there. They rebuilt cooks, bottle washers, anything, and then of course recruits sent from England. They rebuilt as just one battery in another regiment, 7th Medium Regiment, and they're equipped with 5.5-inch guns. To use a technical term that I'm sure that Chris is familiar with, big bangy things.
Yes.
They have big bangy things. See, they're all big.
Not that big, but yeah.
Oh, they fire a sort of 100-pound, 90 to 100-pound shell a long way. I don't do American measurements, I'm afraid. They've got a much longer range. They're fantastic artillery. They then fight. That big bombardment we always see at El Alamein. They're in that. They're one of the guns that open up, and then they push forward through the rest of the North African campaign. I'm going to have to speed up this account because I don't want to. Then they go to Sicily, fight through Sicily, which can be quite nasty for them because they have to bombard villages that have people in them, civilians, just like we're seeing in the Ukraine and things. You fire guns at places, civilians get killed if they're there. In the desert, they don't. Then they fire. Funnily enough, they fire across the. That's how big the guns are. They fire across the Straits of Messina in support of the first landing, not Salerno, the first landing. Then they're withdrawn, brought back to England, reformed into 107 Regiment again, still with the 5.5-inch guns, and then they go across on day. I can't remember. I'm terrible at dates. If you've heard my podcast, you'd know. Number of times I make mistakes with dates. Around about 2 weeks into D-Day campaign, and then they fight through Normandy. They follow the whole campaign. There's very little point in going much further. It builds up to a bit of a climax when they fire the guns in support of going across the Scheldt, going across the canals, and they go right through into Germany, and then of course the anticlimax that comes to every territorial regiment is that they're broken up. They're broken up in Germany at the end of the war, and all regimental histories end up it's slightly disappointing. They don't finish
Right.
with a big finish. They finish with everybody going, "Oh, I'm demobilised. Right, see you then."
Thanks. Gotta go.
It's got to go. A bit like the end of this show, from what I'm told. Apparently, you press a button and I disappear, and you chat about how we can all pay money to Patreon. I mean,
You've got us down. It's all figured out.
I don't know if I can continue. I'm so moved by this so far. Peter, I want to ask you. I just made Chris
Thanks,
out of
Rick.
focus.
Yeah,
I don't know.
such
I
a
think.
mood,
What have you
Chris.
done, Chris?
I haven't touched. I've not touched
You've made
a
yourself.
thing.
Why are you out of focus? Are you? Can we see what's?
You were touching buttons again.
No,
weren't you?
something is wrong on your end. You have to.
Alright,
You have to. I don't know. Check your camera out or something. Peter, let me just say that this is actually way more professional than any of our normal shows. So but we're all on top of this. Quite seriously, so you just described it. First of all, amazing to think about that these guys are essentially in action from 1941 to 1945. I mean, it's many years now, not many months, many years of being in the field there. I want to go back to a battle you described, the Battle of Knightsbridge, which again I think is a battle that most Americans have not heard of, and it takes place to the west of Tobruk in May and June 1942. And I'm not great with dates either. And it's a kind of a horrifying affair in which ends up with, I mean, you, as Chris mentioned earlier, normally you think of infantry as being behind the line someplace. In this case, it's like a duel between the tanks and the guns. There's a painting that you sent us, and it may be a bit fanciful, and it may be the very end of the battle, but it is literally tanks versus artillery, in the desert. Can you talk to us a little bit about the battle, and then perhaps as you do, a little bit about a man you may have touched on his name before, Ray Ellis, who's in the foreground of this painting, who's kind of who starts your book and who is for the first half of the book until he's captured moments after this painting depicts, is with the South Nuts all the way.
Well, the Battle of Knightsbridge is a story that it's quite complex in one way, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. What happens is Rommel's making an attack. He goes the usual thing round the top of the British line, and he descends on the South Nottingham Hussars. This isn't funny, and they have a battle on the 27th of May, and there's some horrendous things happen which are in the book, but that's not the real Knightsbridge that everyone thinks about, because then they think they've defeated Rommel, they think he's falling back, but he hasn't. They've broken through the box system, and they advance forward with the artillery well forward. They fire a barrage and move forward, and they're basically ambushed. And before they know where they are, they're surrounded by tanks. And at night, the British tanks withdraw, and next morning, the South Nottingham Hussars, the purple smoke of the German recognition signals going up all around them. They're basically surrounded. You can get in, but it's very dodgy, and you can't get out. They're told to fight to the last round, and they do. They fight off several attacks. I don't want to be too precise. It's incredibly dramatic. We've got accounts from gun sergeants, officers, a captain, a major, a rather unpleasant character in my view, but every person has their own perspective of what happens. And I'm not going to name them on this, but we have lots of people. We've got the people who are on the wirelesses. We've got people who were driving the vehicles, so they pulled the 25-pounders, gun layers, we've got everybody, and they describe the battle. Even the guy who's looking after the wounded, and he's there, and they've got a place by some sand dunes, and they've got just one vehicle, and they can deal with two or three, and gradually there's people all over. The Germans start firing, their artillery start firing airbursts, and so there's lots of casualties, and then gradually they're sort of surrounded by people desperate for help. And somebody has their legs sliced, somebody's head gets chopped off. There's also two people have to be put out. They couldn't have lived, and it's just dreadful. And then the final scene is when they're basically fighting fighting, you know, the last, and the Germans are all over them. And we're going to talk about oral history later, but if you don't mind, I'll just read a quick excerpt to give you, because there's two things I want to demonstrate about oral history. One is the emotiveness of it and how it can tell a good story. I can also talk about how it's unreliable in talking about fighting scenes in some ways, so it has to be checked, hence 50 interviews. And later we'll perhaps have a quote of how utterly dull but detailed is important. So this is Sergeant Ray Ellis. Do you mind if I read it?
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Well, it's just at the last minute. His gun's been blown up. He doesn't know what's happening, and he sort of wakes up. And he says this: I can remember kneeling and hearing the battle going on in a dazed sort of way. I stayed like that for quite a long time. Then it went quiet again, and I realised the tanks had been fought off. I looked around and my gun was upside down and the crew were draped on the floor all round. I thought I must be wounded, but I couldn't feel anything. My shirt and body were all black, my clothes were all blood-stained, and I was in a hell of a state. I staggered round to look at the crew. Some were obviously dead, and as I went round, I realised I was the only one to survive. The whole crew had been killed. My next thought was for self-preservation, a very strong instinct. Get your head down, Ray. And that's not actually the very end. That's after his first gun's knocked out. And he then goes to a second gun, and one by one, the people on that gun are killed. And then finally, you get the sort of scene at the end. But I think that gives you an idea. Also, note, that's not the spirit of the British Army that you see in regimental histories. Get your head down, right? And when he goes forward to man another gun, he says, very reluctantly.
Can I throw a follow-up in here, Chris?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say and we keep talking about, we'll talk more about things later, and it's fine for us to bounce around a bit, but it takes a lot of trust to get somebody to talk to you in that way, as opposed to giving you sort of the official history, or the mono history. How do you find that it takes a few hours in before people will start giving you a real story?
Essentially, we talk to them first, have a coffee with them, chat about their garden, chat about, things, get them used to you. The oral history position is that you're the son they never had. That has been described as cynical, and also that they'd be quite disappointed with me. But the point is that, if they're right wing, you're right wing. If they're left wing, you're left wing. If they like gardens, you like gardens. I mean, you don't lie about it, but you just give the impression that you are very similar to them and that you admire them enormously. And normally, by the way, this is not a problem, because you do. And then you make it clear to them that they have copyright control, that things won't happen till they're dead. The War Museum won't use it, or I won't. Things don't really start happening unless they give permission. The other thing is you just make it clear to them. We need to know what happened, and that most of them want to tell you what happened. You must have found the same thing, Chris, in your interviews, and I know, Rick, you've done some interviews. Yes. They want to tell you because they feel an indebtedness to the people that suffered more than they did almost. They want to record what happened to them and their comrades. And I think that's very important, and so do they. And so they want to get that through to you. So they do tell you. I could talk about why people talk about... The thing is, regimental histories are an official record. And official records are quite interesting, because if you think where they're based on war diaries, aren't they, usually? Mm-hmm. The adjutant or the intelligence officer keeps. What is their main function? Well, their main function... Make the regiment look good. is making the regiment look good. And reflecting that they've done the best they can, and that's why the British Army reports from right to left. That's why it's so often that they retire due to the retirement of the unit on their right. You can watch this going on, and it's always the same, and it's just not quite accurate. It's not the way things really are. This idea that the men are all dying to get into action, which you must have heard, is not reflected to oral historians. Oral historians do not find that except from very inexperienced troops. If they don't know what's going on, they can be keen on getting into action. But once they've been into action, and Ray Ellis had been through Tobruk and he was on Operation Compass, he's not so keen. That doesn't mean that he doesn't do his duty. And a word that's sometimes frowned upon these days, but I actually think there he is. That classic. My dad had that hairstyle as well, and he still had it when he died. The swine.
Saw that Brill cream held it all there.
Yeah, Brill cream boys. Yeah, they talked about that. But the point is, they did their duty, and they. But why did they do their duty? And the answer is not some noble motivation. It's normally comradeship. And I thought that Stephen Ambrose brought that out well. And I think it's crucial to, it's all about comradeship, about if he can stick it and he can stick it, I can stick it. I don't want to. That's why he says, I'd rather not.
Right.
But I'm going to, I have no choice to maintain my self-respect but to stick it, and I admire that. I find it realistic. People who say, "Oh, dying to get into action," they're the weirdos.
Yeah. Well, I got to say,
no offense intended to.
No, well, I mean, I found it really struck me. There's that part in your book where you talked about only fools and horses and the Uncle Albert line. That most Americans won't know, but it's a British comedy show, and the old veteran starts to tell a story, and they're like, "I'll leave it off," and
leave it out.
Yeah,
I've heard about that a million times. What are you going on about that again?
Right. But you say, and it's true, that these guys were talking to each other, and they did want to talk. Because I know I ran into all the time like, "Oh, I've never heard this before." I'm like, "Well, you never listened."
A lot. I am quite critical of families because they don't listen. They get bored with the same old stories. Often that they don't tell the family. I mean, you don't tell your little children about someone having his leg chopped off in front of your eyes, do you? You just don't.
No.
Where they talk about it is regimental associations of whatever sort. I know they have them in America Land, which I must stop calling America Land. And but also things like the British Legion. They talk to their mates down the pub, and they talk about what happened to them, and they did talk about it then. They found it, as I said, for when a strange I was young then, I'm not now, but when a strange 35-year-old or whatever arrives at their house, they were prepared to tell me because I came from the War Museum, and they wanted to leave their record, and they did. They're fabulous. The time they took, and the emotional turmoil. Some of them said, "Oh, I had terrible nightmares last night after our last session." And when they start crying, we always did the same thing. We're not the media. We switched the mic off. Straight away. Switch the mic off. Go and get them a glass of water, and try again. If they start crying at the same point again, then we move past it because what's really important was the lads. It's not us. We're just trying to get the best account we could, but we don't go pokey like the media do. TV state, you see TV interviews. Oh, your Uncle Ted was torn to pieces. That must have been upsetting. And you want to say no, it was really quite funny when his arm goes off. And
it's
true, what are you going to do? And they interview people who are in emotional. Well, we've interviewed people in emotional turmoil, and we switch the mic off when it goes wrong. And I think that's a responsible attitude. I always have. The War Museum are a government organisation. You're told what to do. They were very good employers. I don't think they regarded me as a good employee.
Well, they kept you around for more than 20 years.
20 plus, Chris. 20 plus.
20 plus.
It's just a big plus. It's a big plus. Right. Well, you were talking about oral history and Ray Ellis reading your book, and Ray Ellis is. I just found him to be a very compelling character, reading the book, and I'm sure it must have been quite gripping to speak to him. There's another. Yeah, so to contrast that, and this is kind of the potential issue with oral history. There's another character you made reference to, Major Daniel, if I'm saying his name correctly.
Daniel.
Daniel.
I don't know how you pronounce it. I can't remember.
But he is well. You talk about that. The issue is that he often doesn't agree with other people because in his oral history, he's the hero of every story.
Well, yes, and he is, and that there is. Well, he was a brigadier when he finished up. He was an interesting man. I quite liked him as a man when I interviewed him. He told me some rattling good stories. A lot of his stories do not tie in with other people. What did I say at the start? That's what we do it for. He was cordially detested in the regiment, I'm afraid, and I find that quite sad that they were because he basically ordered them to form square when it was hopeless. The tanks are on the position. He'd ordered them to move the guns to form a square position like the old British Army ombudsmen and things. And they got massacred. A lot of people were killed when they should have surrendered. And then he drove off himself. and that didn't go down well in the unit. And when he got back, he said they wouldn't fight. And that caused trouble. But he could explain himself, and I tried to let him explain himself in the book. He had been ordered not to surrender. He'd argued, and now he was going to do what he was told. He just went a bit too far with it, and as I say, his ability to keep within the lines of the story as told by almost everybody else. In other words, he was an outrider, always an outrider. In almost every story. In one, he says a bloke was up a tower and he was not wounded, but he had to get him down. And he went up and got him down. But sadly, we interviewed both the bloke who went up, who was up the tower, who was wounded so badly he was out of the war. That was it for him. And also two other people who helped get him down. Do you see what I mean? And stories don't tally at all. Who do I believe? Well, I believe the one who's got the medical records. Because this, we perhaps, as I say, if we talk about when our oral history, you have to check things.
Check it against the records. Against
the all arms battle is equally applicable to history. You can't just use one sort of evidence. You can't just use oral history because oral history can be a way with the fairies. If there's a pub fight, Chris, you must often have been in a pub fight, judging by the state of your nose. And
perhaps, maybe.
Here, we'll give a quick view there so you can check Chris's nose out.
It's all flattened.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
If there's a pub fight, and I suspect none of us have actually been in a pub fight, other than being attacked, possibly. If the police come in and try and find out what happened, everyone's in a state of semi-shock, and nobody can quite tell the same story. You can't tell what had happened 10 minutes after it. So if you have something equally shocking on a battlefield, you're going to run into troubles if you believe everything that's said to you, because a lot of the times they've rebuilt the memory around not much. And that's one of the great, we can talk about the advantage of oral history, but that's one of the great things you've got to be aware of with oral history, that it's not testimony. And I can't stand people using the word testimony. The War Museum do all the time, because it gives it a sort of legal and religious almost things. Whereas if you use the words old men waffling on with parts of it of enormous interest, then you get a better sense of how you need to treat it. And this is why in the First World War, you get people saying, oh, that old egg, he was useless. He's useless because my great-granddad said he was useless. Well, your great-granddad never met Haig. He was a corporal in the sanitary sausages. He never met Haig. He had no idea what was happening from start to finish of the war, and he's parroting what was told to him afterwards. It's not testimony. It doesn't mean anything at all, other than a reflection of an idiot's thoughts. If you see what I mean, and so you have to be careful how you use oral history, but then it's very good for other things. It gives you an idea of what life was like. I call it the zeitgeist, although I had to look up zeitgeist to make sure it's what I thought it did. And it did, but it gives you the sort of spirit of the nature of things. That there are things in life in 1945, 44, 43, 42, that are incredibly similar bully beef tins, things like that. The same things. Funnily enough, you mentioned one Brill cream. We don't use it anymore, but it's still on sale, if you see what I mean. You can still buy crap to put on your hair. But then again, there are some things that were absolutely ordinary that are now, you don't know what they're on about almost. And this is what oral history is good at. It's good at explaining things. I always used an example. You say, what did you have? And it's a First World War example. You don't mind me straying into that, do you?
Absolutely not.
You ask them what they had to eat in the First World War, you know, British in the First World War, and a bad informant, although they're all good in the sense that we treasure what they give us, but a bad informant will say, yeah, we had food. You know, and then other people will say, yeah, we had food. We had bully beef, that's corned beef, and it in tins, and it had a key, and you opened it, and we had pork and beans, that's haricot beans, baked beans in a tin with a little bit of pork, and we had blah 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 blah, and they give you details. You can find that out almost anywhere. And then some people will sort of attach it to an amusing story. So, and the classic one that is the said, you might not know that, you might not have the same tins, but they had the bully beef tins had a key, and often it breaks, the thing won't come off, so you get a knife. And the only thing I've got in common with a student, with a soldier, is they used a bayonet and I used a knife, but the result was the same.
Right.
Because you always cut yourself. And I remember this old bloke I interviewed in Nottingham. This was a First World War veteran. Oh, boy, 4 years in the war, never touched. Bully beef can. Look at that. Look, I still got a bloody scarf. and that brings home something you might not have thought of. But then there's the thing you really haven't thought of. What did they do with the cans? Well, a good regiment buried them. A bad regiment throws them into no man's land. Why are they a bad regiment? Because if you're patrolling in no man's land, the last thing you want is bully beef cans that you kick when you're in no man's land. See what I mean? So good regiments who patrol in no man's land don't throw their cans forward. They bury them or throw them back. They're from somewhere, no, in the British. But you see what I mean? And suddenly oral history is giving you something I didn't know. And that's what that's the best example I've got of that. But also the human element. Words on a page are not the same as the human voice, especially if that human voice isn't some sort of 67-year-old git like me, but it's the actual bloke who was there, and we've got their voices. And when Ray Ellis reads this stuff, it's quite emotional at times.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
So, you know, one of the book is a fantastic example of oral history done correctly. The other great value I got out of the book, and I think American readers would get out of the book, is just the British experience of World War II. When I say that, I mean, you know, for Americans, we get bombed at Pearl Harbor. Everybody's patriotic. They rush to the colors. They might be in action by late 42, early 43. 45, it's over. We go home. Everything's great. For the British, it's a much longer war.
It is a much longer. It is.
And the reaction to it is different. So I guess what I'd like you to do maybe is talk a bit about kind of the reaction of these men when their unit goes to war. And so you say some wonderful things about what their fathers had warned them about from the Great War. And then just how they continue to function. I mean, this is 6 years.
It's amazing how they do it. Their fathers had warned them not to join the infantry. Because you have to walk.
Right.
And it's yeah, and it's dangerous. The village I come from, the stand-up in Weardale, I don't sound like it because I moved, but the War Memorial's got 6 DLI, Durham Light Infantry Regiment, all of that. Second World War, the Artillery, Royal Army Service Corps, Royal Artillery Corps, RAF, everything but the bloody Durham Light Infantry. And that's what the sort of thing. When they go off, I mean, you do get the grinding down of them, the ones who survive. There's a chap called Harold Harper who is with the unit throughout. He escapes Knightsbridge because he's back behind. He's in B echelon. And Harold Harper went from being a private a gunner to being a battery or regimental sergeant major. I can't remember which battery I would go for. And he was the most wonderful old boy. But he talked about how gradually his nerve, the build-up of just, you go to the cliche is you go to the well once too often sometimes, and you start to get really edgy and really upset. And it's going on for so long. I mean, 6 years to us is quite a long time. But we're old, so time does pass quickly. I mean, to you, you only started doing these podcasts, it seems, 2 weeks ago. And, you're on number 94. How did that happen? Where's that 2 years gone? You know? Right. And it's the same for me. I started my podcast 2 years ago, and I can't believe that we, you know. But when you're sort of 18 to 20, well, 22, it's from, say, 20 to 26. It's the best years of your life, and it's the years that normally seem to last a lifetime. I can't explain that. You either know what I mean or I don't. That every year seems to go on forever, and these guys spent their best years in the army with some bugger shooting at them, on and off, quite often on. Stukas, God, Stukas, how terrifying were they? Not very effective. We all know that actually Stukas are sitting ducks later on in the war. They're death machines for the Germans then, aren't they? But in 1940, 41, they're really nasty. And then you go on and you it just builds up, and they're not in such great danger in 44, 45. They're not, because they're firing long range. But still, I mean, I remember interviewing one guy, whose name I can't quite remember, but he didn't like the sea. He was sent off in a floating tank to for the observer across the Scheldt, and his tank sank, and he couldn't abandon it because it was the only working wireless, and he was acting as a forward observation officer, and that, you know, he got a military cross for it, and very, very brave man. But you know, the stress builds up and builds up and builds up. And there was one, I can't remember his name. In fact, I'm not going to remember his name deliberately as well. So, and this what he'd risen to be. I think he was. I can't remember. He was a sergeant, but he was told off for Japan. You know, the war's finished in Europe. They fought all the way through, and then they're told off for Japan because the war in Japan doesn't finish till August. Right. And he was told off for that, and he was just so upset. He said he went so anti-army, and he went home and complained, and eventually it all went away. But it was a terrible time. So the war was terribly long. And when they got back, is the point I'd like to make for the lads. When they got back, you know, say you two, there's three of us, I go off to war, and there's you two. We all worked in, say, a small factory. And when we went off, we were all, say, clerks or something. But you had a bad leg and you had terrible piles. And so, you know, you don't go to war. I come back in 6 years' time. I'm a battery sergeant major. You know, you two are now managing the factory. Right. And you can't catch up. When you come back, they offer you your job back. They don't offer you the equivalent job if you'd been there for 6 years. Right. They offer you the job you were on. And some of them had to leave. They couldn't face working for you two bastards. You know,
I understand that.
War. You haven't even been to war. Look at your piles. And they're like that. And they have to leave and go and work for something else, you know, because they just can't face having it rammed at home. I mean, if you're in a profession, like if you're in the legal profession or anything like that, you've got all these exams to do and things. Your 6 years of your life has been lost. And you never really get it back. So, yeah, it's a long war. Sorry, I do talk too much.
No, but that was the point. I think that's a perspective on the war that I don't think most Americans have, because our experience was, obviously there's some similarities, but there is that difference, just the length of it.
I'd like to do this because I'm afraid I like to do this. The other thing about oral history is the mind-boggling detail. Sorry, I told you, I warned you. And I like the fact that they get onto utterly tedious things. And this is Gunner Ken Giles, A Troop 107. This is in Sicily. And he's describing what they're doing. Or it may have been before Alamein. I can't remember anymore. 2 years ago, 3 years ago since I wrote the book. Because you know how they come out later. And he says this, and this is dull, but listen to the detail that explains how things work. He says this: I was in the command post working out the counter battery lists, which came through from presumably divisional headquarters, giving the coordinates of enemy gun positions, the enemy batteries, which would have been found out through flash spotting or sound ranging. Now he misses out aerial observations. Notice that oral history isn't perfect. There were sometimes upwards of 200 of these batteries. They all had code numbers such as XC, CY, DJ, that sort of thing. When we were required to fire on an enemy battery, we'd get an order from our battery command post through to our troop. Target counter battery XY. Instead of having to work out the coordinates to save time, they would have already been worked out so that I had them down on the list. I didn't have to refer to the artillery board or anything else. Artillery board, I'm not going to explain. Don't understand it myself. It's mathematical. So one was able to pass the fire orders immediately to the guns who would then engage the target. Of course, if we fired too much from one gun position, the enemy would have done precisely the same thing, and we ourselves would soon be shelled. And now that's pretty dull, right? And I try to keep that sort of stuff out of the book, but I like to put some in because it shows that other side of oral history, the sort of mind-boggling detail and stuff that you don't really. It's written down in manuals and things, but who reads a manual? But you need to understand how gunnery works. Because gunnery is much more complicated than the people think who don't think about gunnery. Gunnery it dominates Second World War battlefields. Guns can fire continuously if you get the logistics in place. Got to say that. Aircraft can bomb you, then you have to go back. It's not continuous, especially if it's a small thing. And so that's quite an interesting aspect. Anyway, there we go. What else would you like to ask? I promise no more readings.
Too bad for us. I mean, there's a bunch of different directions we could go in here because, I mean, I think it is very interesting that you've written about an artillery unit. And I mean, I think honestly, in all of the readings that I've done, when you think of popular books about World War II, historical books, and people write about infantry, and they write about tanks, and they write about the brave pilots, and they write about the code breakers and everything, and artillery is never written about. And how would you balance, you've got artillery, you've got infantry, you've got armor, how would you balance the importance of those? Where do you come in on that?
I think artillery is the dominant battlefield weapon in the final couple of years of the war, but it's not the only one. It is it's the same as when we use history, all armed. We use all the sources of history. We don't just use one. And artillery is so important. The British had a mastery of artillery at the end of the First World War. Don't believe this rubbish about the British not being competent in at the end of the First World War. They were the best killing machine in the world. Is that good? I don't know. But they were mainly based around their artillery. That was all lost by the time of the Second World War. We didn't concentrate our artillery at all. And in the book, you actually see this happening. You see the South Nottingham Hussars acting as a battery or a troop, which is a part of a battery, and not as a regiment, or not as several regiments. But gradually, as the book goes on, you see them being moved up together. Tobruk, they're part of a 4 or 5 battery, and then later on, at El Alamein, there's masses of them. And then they form the Army Group Royal Artilleries. AGRA, they normally use stupid acronyms, but the South Nottingham has become a small part in a huge, bloody, murderous weapon of war, which will deluge shells on a particular place. And these shells weigh £100 each, and they go bang. Normally I'd have shouted it in the microphone to make it jump, but I've done enough stupid things in this interview, so knocking it over, that kind of thing. But you see my point. So artillery is absolutely crucial. But I'm not one of those historians who think that it's more important in the sense of, you see, it wouldn't be important at all without the infantry or the logistics teams or the Navy or the Air Force or the tanks. They all play their part. And if one of them was removed, well, they'd all be buggered. So I think that the artillery is in my view, is the dominant weapon which allows us to dominate the battlefield from 1940, well, El Alamein onwards. But the tanks have a vital role. My next book is on the 5 and 4 yeomanry. So I normally say 5D4. So
I like that. Yeah.
I'm congratulating myself on avoiding that. But the unsung heroes are the artillery. But the infantry, who are often praised, they're incredibly important. And if anybody suffers, it's the infantry. And I do want to remind people that whilst the Americans and the British did a jolly good job in the Second World War together, the Russian army won the war, in a lot of historians' view. And without them, we'd have done nothing. So it's all a matter, it's not just saying, oh, the artillery are the most important. I do not believe that in that sense that they could do anything on their own. They're part of an all-arms battle. And the more of the arms are present and working properly, the better it will go for your side. Unless the enemy have also got their arms all together. Right. One thing is that the Germans lost the air. Well, that makes a hell of a difference because they're not all-arms battle anymore, are they? You see what I mean? So if you take one out, like they do in Normandy in 44, 45, you lose the German air. They surrender air. Well, that makes a hell of a difference to what's going on the ground. So it's all fascinating, but I do not. It's a story of the artillery that needs to be emphasised more. That's all. And I just wanted to bring it into focus. And I'd done the interviews, and I wanted to tell that story, and I did.
So Peter, what are the, we've talked about the value of oral histories, some of the weaknesses of oral histories, but you also bring another expertise to the books that you write, and that is actually going to some of these places. So could you just talk a little bit or briefly about the importance of actually going to a battlefield and seeing the ground and how that helps, tell the story?
I do believe that. I am guilty of writing books without having visited, and I've always, in fact, Gallipoli, which I wrote 2 books out, my first book on, I hadn't been there. When I went out there, it was as I thought, but I learned far more from actually being on the ground. I understood it far better, and I wrote another book about it, which I think I realised that there's 2 sides, because the English are rubbish. So are the Americans, by the way. We don't speak. No, we don't speak other languages, do we?
Right.
As a rule, I don't know how many you speak, lads, but I can read French. That's pretty well it. I can't speak French. J'aimerais beaucoup le bière. Dirk Spear, s'il vous plaît. Je vous aimerais. Yeah.
Un verre de vin rouge, s'il vous plaît. Oui. Yeah. Important phrases.
But the point is, recently, I'm far more known as a Great War historian. There's no 2 ways about it. But recently, I've been obviously taking a great interest in visiting Second World War battlefields, not to make money. I'm a retired elderly gentleman. I'm all right. But because it's bloody interesting. And I believe you take tours to Normandy. Normandy is unbelievably interesting. The logistics around the harbours, the pipelines, the battlefields, where Goodwood and Epsom for me, because of the 5D4 files. By the way, the South Nottingham Hussars provided the barrage for the tank battle at Goodwood. But not on their own, in an agra. In fact, more than one agra, and there was a huge bombing raid as well. That's what I meant about all-arms battle. But you cannot get a grip of a battlefield without visiting it, in my view. And I would never do without. On the other hand, I'm about to write a book on the Sudan, 1898. Gordon to Khartoum to I've very little intention of
visiting the Sudan.
Well, it's dangerous, and I'm too old. If I was 20, 30 years younger, I might go, but it's too threatening an environment for a stupid civilian who's got no common sense.
Well, I wish you the best of luck on your. You said you're going back to Gallipoli in April,
May and September, yeah.
May. And Chris and I will talk about this after we unceremoniously dump you. But we'll be going back to Normandy in April and many other places in Europe. But Peter Hart, it has been fantastic to have you on our show today. I wish you would come out of your shell a little more. So maybe after a few more experiences like this, you'll feel competent to
get more
handling.
confident.
Yeah. And I want to remind everybody that although he's written many books, and this one he says is 2 books ago, so he barely remembers it, the book we were talking about today is At Close Range, Life and Death in an Artillery Regiment, 1939 to 1945. And it's a terrific book. It's a terrific book and worthwhile.
I also want to jump in and add, please check out Pete and Gary's military history on the podcasts. You'll hear a lot more about the South Nottingham Hussars, lots of other topics, and you will hear a range of accents that will boggle the mind.
And then for real fun, you can check out Pete Hart's other fun activity as the lead singer of a punk rock band, not making this up, Those Naughty Lumps, right?
Fine body men. Fine body men.
Yeah, Those Naughty Lumps. So you can Google it and see him in action, and we hope you will. And but it's the rare historian who can pull that off as well. So Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So much.
Thanks. Cheers, lads.
Bye-bye.
Oh wow, I'm big. I gotta make myself smaller. Yeah, he was just duller than paint drying on a wall, huh? Wow. Whew. No, amazing.
Sorry,
yeah, amazing. Fantastic. So you score on that one, Chris. We're gonna give you lots of points for that. I just want to say to people who are still here, if you liked what you saw today, and why wouldn't you? It was awesome. Could you please like us if you're on Facebook, or subscribe if you are on YouTube? It will only take a moment. And we want to thank all the people who come out and support us via Patreon, and we hope you'll join us as a Patreon patron on patreon.com/historyhappyhour, because we need a little help to keep the history taps open. And Chris, I want to mention in terms of traveling to Europe,
yes,
we've talked about the Normandy masterclass that we're doing in April. Just one spot left.
Hey, great.
One spot. And there's a maximum limit on that. So it's a hard cap, as we say. So if you were thinking about that and you're interested and you haven't done anything about it, well, it's Mardi Gras coming up in New Orleans. So they're not going to be in the office till Wednesday.
So have a few more drinks so when your inhibitions are down, sign up for the tour.
But if you email to info@stephenambrosetours.com, they'll get it and get back to you on Wednesday. Chris, what's going on in this space next week? I mean,
next week we're doing sort of a history happy hour field trip. We're going to go to one of London's oldest and most historic hotels and talk about its amazing wartime and espionage history.
I called it the Spy Hotel. Is that good?
It is.
Is that close?
It is. Yes, it is called the House of Spies here. So it's a wonderful story. Pretty much anybody involved in espionage or intelligence work from the First World War up into the present day has passed through the hotel, and we're going to have Stephen Duffy, who's the head of security at the hotel, give us our own private tour of some of the nooks and crannies.
Wow, that sounds amazing, and something a little different. Really excited about that. I'm not sure what book I'm supposed to read this week, but I know you'll be working on that reading list, so you'll let me know, right?
Got it.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us again. We really appreciate it. Stay well.
Stay safe, everyone.